So it's going to be like the next 6 months. I'm just going to be like head down, work as much as I can.
Oh, you only have half a year left?
Hopefully.
If you can.
My current, like, I proposed to my committee, graduate May 2024.
Okay. May 2024. Well, that's a year. Oh, wait, I guess we're... No.
It's November.
I don't know what
It's November, man. This year has flown by.
But I think that would be kind of a good place to start if you're all right with that.
Yeah.
To jump kind of into your background a little bit.
Yeah.
But ladies and gents, welcome back to Articulate with Steve McJones. This week we have one Mr. Walker Gosrich.
Hello. Thank
Mr.
you so
Gray
much
Skies?
for having me. Yeah, when the whole sky is gray on Instagram.
Yeah.
I'm trying to blow up. Follow me.
It's just pictures of when the whole sky is gray.
Yeah, but I also put some poems in there too.
Oh, really?
Yep.
I haven't seen any of those ones yet.
Well, you just look at the captions. There's poems in there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. I'll check those
Check
out.
it out.
But yeah, so you right now are trying to get your PhD in
Robotics and artificial intelligence.
Oh wow, so this is your thing.
Yeah.
whole
Yeah. No, and I think that's sort of how I got on the whole like autonomous weapons systems thing.
Sure.
Is because I came in with like this idyllic vision of like, oh, I'll be working on these robots that are going to be taking jobs that people don't want and don't care about. And then we're going to live in a utopia where our robots do the farming and we just like sit on our asses and get like beautiful food delivered to us.
Yeah.
And then I sort of got into the academia, like the whole world.
Nitty-gritty.
And soon realized that like most of the stuff that we do in like robotics academia is funded by the Department of Defense, by the military.
Oh.
And so even though academics, some very, very supportive of military aims, some not so much, when you're taking that money, the work that you're doing is still going to go towards the goals of the military.
Sure.
You know,
Or of
for
the
better or
company
for
that is
worse.
funding capitalism.
Capitalism.
But how did you let's take it back just a step before we jump too far into it. How did you decide that you wanted to even go into college for this? Was there, when you were a kid, were you super into Transformers or I don't understand.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I think that I was just good at building things.
Okay.
I just always liked it, just like this. There's no happier place to me than like building IKEA furniture. Like and so I went into college I love it, man. And I went into college for mechanical engineering for that reason. Like I just love like building all just random devices to solve problems, super fun. And then I just, at least for me, I'm someone who was good at school as a kid, and I was like always getting this positive reinforcement from school, like, oh wow, you're so good at school, you're so good at taking these tests.
Yeah.
And so I got into college, still good at taking tests.
Sure.
Awesome. And then I'm like, all right, well shit, what's next? More school, that's where like everyone was like, oh man, you should be like you should do your PhD, be a professor.
Right.
I was like, awesome, yeah, I can definitely do that, like that aligns with my skill set.
Sure.
And so I sort of just kept like moving on that sort of staircase of academics. I applied to grad school. I applied to like 25 places. I applied for all these fellowships because that's what they were like in college. Colleges want to have a lot of fellowship recipients graduating.
Sure.
And so they like put us in this program. They're like, all right, for the next 3 years, we're going to tell you sort of like year by year, here's like the stuff you got to do to like get your resume to the point where by the time you graduate, you're a good candidate for these fellowships. And so that was like, I did some cool stuff like with that, like a lot of volunteer work that I probably wouldn't have otherwise done. But it was still like this process of almost, I was like, just like, through years being taught like how to sculpt myself into the perfect candidate for these fellowships.
Right.
And so by the time I graduated, I was a good candidate for these fellowships. And I applied to a bunch and I got a fellowship and I got into grad school. And so now I'm at Penn in my 6th year.
Okay.
And that was a whole process of like, all right, I got to like this next step in the academic ladder. What does that mean?
Right.
What do I actually want to do with that?
Yeah.
Like, what impact am I having? What does my work look like?
Right.
And sort of just like realizing that the vision that I had in my head, like as a kid or as like a college student who was like, super into academics was different than the reality of that.
Of what you actually will do with academics.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting because you were so caught up in the idea of expanding your own intelligence and working on it in an academic way.
Mhm.
And so, what was the transition to, oh, what about artificial intelligence? You know what I mean?
Oh,
There is
interesting.
kind of a through line there where it is still in a way academia and implanting academia within machines, I would
Yeah.
say.
Well, I feel like for me personally, I came at it from the perspective of I like building things. I'm
Okay,
good at building things. It's fun to build things.
sure.
And then I got into, PhD work and realized that the research landscape was not about building things.
Right.
Like, that is just not where things get published. That is not where people are making breakthroughs that are getting, lots of like traction in industry or like lots of citations in their papers. It's much more about algorithms, about like writing code that controls things.
Yeah.
Because at this
Well,
point,
in a way,
like,
that's still building, right? Building code.
for sure, for sure.
Yeah.
And that was like a different experience for me because it's different building like building a machine versus building an electrical system versus building like a computer, like building a system in code, like building, like a game or a physics engine that games use to run, or building an algorithm for a robot. That's still building something, but it's almost like increasing levels of abstraction.
Yeah.
And as you like increase that level of abstraction, it becomes it feels different
Yeah.
from build.
Well,
Like,
and that's what I was wondering is it didn't fulfill that little IKEA building furniture part of it.
no, it like a little bit, like it scratches that itch a tiny bit, but
Yeah.
it leaves a lot to be desired because
Sure.
in the end, I'm not using my hands.
Right.
I'm not like, getting down on my knees and like getting greasy and shit.
Yeah.
I'm now sitting on my ass for like 10 hours straight and just
Right.
like trying to focus on like staring at a computer screen,
Yeah.
which like it can be really satisfying to do that and like build something and it works, but it's definitely a different feeling.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
So how did you get into the AI field and develop that part of your knowledge?
Yeah, so that was primarily because that's where the research in robotics is happening right now.
Oh, just in general.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's like, there is a lot of work, around like building new types of robots. And that's kind of what my lab does. I'm in the mod lab. We build modular robots, which
Mhm.
means a ton of little modules, little parts that independently aren't that like capable of doing anything, but can connect together and can reconfigure to do sort of a ton of different types of things.
Yeah.
Um, but that and other sort of parts of the field like it are just every single part of the field is being, there's a little bit of AI in it.
Mm.
And then the AI part of the field is the fastest growing part. And so I sort of realized that in my first couple of years and realized that, professors for sure are like holding us back a little bit because they're like, no, 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 that's not how we do it. No,
Mm.
AI research makes a lot of people who have been in the field for a long time uncomfortable
Really?
because it feels a little bit less like science.
Yeah.
And the reason is that like you take these super complex systems that have been so artificial intelligence. Can I do like a little
Yeah.
little
Man.
definition?
Yeah. That's what the long form podcast is great for.
Yeah.
We could do anything.
Yeah,
Man.
all right. Sweet. So artificial intelligence generally 99% of the time people are talking about it refers to machine learning,
Mm.
typically refers to a subset of machine learning called deep learning.
Okay.
And deep learning is neural networks. And so you might have heard this term. Neural networks are based on like the original idea was like, oh, we could make things like how neurons connect in a human or animal brain,
Okay.
right? And so there's all of these sort of neurons, artificial neurons
Mm.
that are, initialized to sort of randomly connect to one another and randomly like influence one another.
Right.
And then through throwing a shit ton of data at it,
Right.
you train it to respond in a certain way,
Okay.
similar to how you like train an animal to, train a dog to sit or like to fetch or something. Is like
Roll
you
over.
you give it rewards and you tell it, okay, that was good, that was bad, and
Mhm.
eventually it learns to connect things in a way that is giving you the result that you've trained
Well,
it
that's
to get.
interesting. And so it can learn good and bad. How do you give a robot a reward?
So it's all numbers,
Okay.
right? So like I'll say that like maybe the simplest example is like image recognition.
Mhm.
And so what you'll do
Which
is
is
you'll
big.
Yeah.
on the autonomous weapons.
Oh,
for sure.
generally, it's just one of the technologies that I think is going to be
Because it's
really
getting
impactful.
a robot to see like a human. Basically.
Yeah, but in a different way than a human, in a way that's a little, it's alien a little
Sure.
bit, right? It's like it's able to discern faces instantly, and
Yeah.
like you can use facial recognition to tell someone's pulse just from the changing colors of their skin.
That's crazy.
Like it can do shit differently than people.
Yeah, so what's the example?
So with facial recognition, or sorry, not with facial recognition, but with image recognition generally,
Right.
like you want to train a neural network, a machine learning algorithm to recognize, okay, is this a cat or is this a dog? And so what you do is you feed it a ton of examples, and you have this specific like set of math operations that you are feeding this image raw data into, and then out at the end it spits out a 1 for a cat or a 0 for a dog. And what you tell it is basically, all right, I want you to match the labeled images that I have. So I have 1 for dog, 0 for cat for like 10,000 images.
Yeah.
And I need you to go and figure out which set of like weights, which set of specific like math operations results in you getting the highest accuracy on this training data set that I have.
Okay.
And so you end up with this fine-tuned, very complex, often it can be like megabytes or gigabytes of just binary, like that's the representation of these set of math operations is a megabyte or a gigabyte that you feed an image through, and then it spits out 1 for dog and 0 for cat.
Okay.
And what's sort of scary to that about people who have been in this field for a long time is before what we would do is we're like, all right, first we're going to, use this piece of code to extract the edges of objects in the image. And then we're going to like see if we can represent some, the shape of a cat or the shape of a dog by like these specific math operations. And you're like very much deductively going through and being like, all right, using this piece of logic, we can figure out this part. And then like, so you understand every step of the process.
Right.
But with artificial intelligence in all of its applications, it's kind of like you hear people refer to it as a black box, which means that we fed in all this data. We got it to perform better than any other algorithm that we've ever created has been able to do at recognizing cat versus dog or recognizing faces. But we don't know how it's doing.
We don't know how it's doing it. That's interesting.
Like we have general ideas. We can make some mathematical proofs about like, we think this has 98% accuracy under these conditions. But those are number 1, hard to do, and number 2, super conservative.
Yeah.
So we end up with the system that's really effective, but really hard to gauge where it fails, where it succeeds.
Yeah.
And like, so it just has this aspect of unpredictability.
Just for my sake of mind, how did you, again, I wanted to, how did you like reward the system for being more accurate?
So this might be a little technical, but in machine learning, there's something typically called a loss function or a reward function that you use. And it is a function of the output. And it can be, you can do it a couple different ways. There's something called like imitation learning, where you basically train your system to imitate an expert. And that's kind of what I was talking about with like this labeled data set. That's similar to that.
Sure.
And that is like, all right, you get a reward for how close your answer is to the output of this expert.
Okay.
And so in my research, I'm teaching teams of robots to like better coordinate in like, examples like, maybe we want to like have a team of robots like cover an area so that they can like spread pesticide or something on an agricultural field. What I do is I have this expert algorithm that I've kind of hand designed that has more information than the system could ever do. And I'm like, all right, these are the actions that my expert would take in a specific circumstance. And then I train the model. The reward is like, how close are you to my expert actions? So the actions can be like, the output of the machine learning system can be really complicated, like a set of robot actions for a whole team, or it can be simple, like a 1 and a 0 for a cat versus a dog.
Right.
But either way, what you're doing is saying, all right, you are rewarded for how close you are to the expert example.
Well, that's interesting because then, in that sense, the idea of a reward, I feel like within a living being it's an emotional response. So you get a reward and you're happy about it. Whereas in a robot or a machine, you're like, this is correct. Like the one, the one is like you
Yeah.
did the right thing, and
Yeah.
then it just inputs that as more data.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and so there's another type of machine learning. So I talked about imitation learning of an expert. There's another type called reinforcement learning, which is much more similar to how we like. Maybe you can say that it's more similar to how people and animals learn.
Okay.
Because instead of saying, okay, you get more reward for how close you are to an expert, you're saying, all right, I'm defining some abstract like reward that you get for a behavior. The reward might be like, one example is like, say you want a robot arm to grab something. The reward could be like how close you got that thing to a specific point, or how successful you were in grabbing it, or how stable your grasp is. Like you can define all these different sorts of rewards. And then basically you're sort of letting the system free to explore like the space of things it can do. And it's just going to figure out what the sort of series of actions or types of policies are that give it the best reward.
So in a sense, then it has a lot more free will using that black box.
Yeah, which is it's both really interesting and really scary. And I also think the fear is overhyped too.
Well, this is coming back to where researchers are a
Yeah.
little nervous about giving the autonomy.
Yeah, and I wanna be very clear that researchers are not worried about creating an intelligent like machine that destroys humanity.
Sure.
Like there are some for sure, but far and away like robotics researchers who work on this stuff like day to day, this stuff works so bad. It is so hard to get an artificial intelligence system to do what you want it to do.
Okay.
Or to do anything at all, really.
Yeah.
That the idea of creating a Terminator accidentally,
Yeah.
to me and to many in my field is just ridiculous.
Yeah, it's hard not to talk about it though.
Yeah.
I feel like the Terminator fallacy comes up quite a bit.
Yeah.
When doing any research for this, and the little research that I did do it, because everybody's like, yeah, but what about Skynet though?
Yeah.
And then everyone's like, shut up. Would you not?
You're not helping.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it does like. And okay, getting back to like this reinforcement learning thing, there's like little aspects of this that like sort of get at our fears of like Skynet because it's a black box. Like for example, you might tell a robot, all right, in this simulation, you're going to need to learn to walk. Your reinforcement, the reinforcement reward that I'm giving you is how fast can you move forward. And typically, if you don't design your simulator really, really well, your system will find some flaw in your simulator, like the physics engine. Like, oh, I can force my leg slightly below the surface and then I'll sort of explode this way.
Right.
And so it'll find like these exploits and these weird little tricks, which is like, honestly, that's anytime you're working with computer systems, it's gonna like find the way to break what you've done, But like artificial intelligence, very good at it. And that's something that like gets at this fear of like, oh, it's out of control, and it's gonna do stuff that we don't want to, because like that's not what we wanted to do, right? We wanted to learn like a normal walking gait that's like effective, and instead it's like exploding itself from the floor, like launching itself forward.
Right.
But these errors are not useful.
Right.
And they're not doing anything effectual because they're happening in this like made up simulator world.
Yeah.
And so that I think is sort of where some of the fears of like Skynet come in, but also where we can dispel them is this shit might make sense in our crazy simulator world that does not represent the real world, but it is just so hard to translate anything into the real world, and it is just so hard to get anything to do anything effectively in the real world.
So people take the unpredictability of the action that an AI will take and say, oh, that's unpredictable because they have a different intent of how they want to use the information and data that we gave them. When in reality, it's just like, it's just completely random, and there's no intent. They're just like doing it.
Exactly. I think that's a really good way to think about it. People see this like, oh, it's doing something I didn't expect as it being really smart.
Yeah.
It's being really dumb.
Yeah.
It's the opposite.
Yeah. I mean, so you're still researching it and building your own code and everything. So then from just the AI field, how did you dive into the rabbit hole of AI autonomous weaponry?
Yeah, so I think that started for me, as I sort of came to this realization that academia was not this place of pure, exploration of basic science that I had very naively and very idyllic sort of vision of it
Yeah.
from like when I was in undergrad.
Right. Wow, you can explore anything.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Like, oh, academics up in their ivory tower, they're not influenced by anything. They
Right.
just some of that comes from people who are working on this stuff don't really, a lot of times, don't really want to be working on military technology.
Mm.
And so they'll write in their papers, like, and I've done this too. My funding for this research that I was talking about with swarms of robots that are like, covering a field or covering, like, you could use these systems to like spread out over a forest fire to monitor how it's spreading, right?
Mhm.
Because I don't particularly support the military applications of my research, I'm going to write about those applications.
Mm.
But just as valid are military applications, and my funding is coming from the Army right now.
Mm.
I'm funded by the Army on this project. They're funding me because they're interested in the military applications.
Mhm.
If anything, the military applications are going to be, first of all, they're going to happen first because the Army's funding it.
Mhm.
The Army has an interest, and the Army has, you know, more than half of the research dollars that are spent in this country come
Mhm.
from the DoD. Don't quote me on that fact, but at least a half of robotics research is funded by the DoD.
Right.
And so these military applications, even though scholars tend to talk about agriculture, about environmental monitoring, about, search and rescue,
Mhm.
I think a real like turning point for me on my view of like the military's impact on academia was when I was working on a search and rescue algorithm.
Mm.
And I was reading this paper, and it was using the exact same mathematical formulation. Because really, when we're writing a paper, what it boils down to is what new math you're introducing into the field.
Sure.
My exact same mathematical formulation that I was using for search and rescue, they were using for search and destroy.
Oh, wow.
Mathematically identical.
Yeah.
And that's dual use, right? That
Right.
is the idea that you can use both, is the same technology for both civilian and military, and that is an inescapable fact of technology.
Yeah.
But it's also like, I don't know, to me that was a really challenging moment because I
Mm.
was like, I don't have control over the shit that I make.
Yeah.
Like, I don't have control over
It's not
how
like you're
people use
trademarking.
it.
Yeah.
Exactly. I don't have control over how people think about it,
Intellectual property. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, no, that was sort of one of my inflection points of realizing that scientists aren't as separated from the funding source as they like to think that they are.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's scary because, you need the funding to be able to explore the things that you want to explore, to have this ivory tower of academia, as
Yeah.
you said, is like we need the money to be able to do that because it is very metaphysical and, a lot of times hypothetical and theoretical. And the actual application boils down, after the funding has kicked in
Yeah.
and we've been able to test these theories and been able to test the algorithms multiple times
Yeah.
to the point where the accuracy is to 98, 99%
Mhm.
of the time, right?
Yeah. And it's like, where in what portion of application are you going to have the funding to really take this from the initial state to this state of deployment? It's in the sectors that have the most money, and that tends to be the military.
Right.
There are, of course, plenty of good applications. And I also don't want to like generally shit talk the robotics community because there is still so much important. I think that we still have a fundamental need to explore basic
Mhm.
science. Like, I really like fundamentally like support the exploration of basic science.
Yeah.
It's just that I think that we as a community of academics, as a community generally, as like, I don't think the US reckons with the fact that most of our research dollars are towards this military aspect
Right.
and towards this just increased militarization of of science, of
Mhm.
technology.
Yeah, I mean it's like the benefits of AI and technology versus the deficits of AI and technology. Like I actually had a guy, one of my best friends from Ohio, Chris Beckman. He is just he was a robotics major and went
Mhm.
to like a career school for that, and he worked with these robots that literally could detect a car and then paint it like automatically, shoot it with a gun and paint it.
Yeah.
And immediately the car was painted, ready to ship off to the next part of
Yeah.
the process. So it's like there are really cool applications for things like this.
Yeah.
But like you said, 50% of the funding goes into military aspects.
Yeah.
And that is unfortunate.
Yeah. I mean, depending on your perspective, that's really unfortunate. I am kind of a pacifist. I'm kind of a leftist.
Exactly.
And so to me, I really don't like seeing technology applied to kill people.
Right. But that being said, that's a certain portion. We are a certain portion of the world. So when you're thinking about the application of the military aspects of this technology, you do have to consider that we're not everybody. You know what I mean? We don't think like everybody. So, in the case of the easiest example being China.
Yeah.
Right. So China, the people at the top of the government and technology sector, well, they're in control of all of the sectors because, the government that China is.
Yep. CCP's got a lot of power over there.
They are, oh God, we're going to get killed.
I dare not call it total power. But.
Yeah, right. But in general, they can say, hey, we're going to look past the, philosophical and emotional and moral obligations and just make the technology. And then we'll figure it out from there. But they are already just like piling in. And I'm sure they probably, I'm probably giving them a little bit more credit than maybe, I don't know what's going on in China, if I'm being honest.
Yeah, no, I don't either. They're very capable scientists,
but
though.
That's
I
the
can
thing.
tell you
They're
that
very
much.
capable.
Yes.
Right. So when considering like our moral obligations is to kind of what the other side is stating and what I've learned, again, and you can correct me anywhere that you want, but it sounds like what's going on in the military right now is, okay, we understand that there are moral obligations that we should be tied to, but as for right now, nobody is keeping anybody like under any strict regulation with these things. And so we need to be able to keep up with potential enemies so that way if they get to a place that we can match them at that place. And then we can talk about, mutually assured destruction or something like that.
Yeah. No, I think that's kind of the exact right assessment of it. Like, I think military applications of technology are going to grow to fill the space that they are allowed. And I mean that in terms of like what we as a global society establish as the rules and norms of what you're allowed to do in war. We will figure out how to do like to the greatest extent. And then, of course, even beyond that, because people do commit war crimes, and the U.S. has, of course, committed war crimes. And like I feel like with like nuclear weapons is, of course, a great example of that, like the most recent and looming largest example, because that is where we had to put a cap on this stuff.
Right.
Or else we were going to blow the whole planet up, you know?
Yeah.
And like AI weapons are definitely a different character of threat, but my sort of overarching view is that we need to put a cap on that as well.
Right.
Because the future implications of artificial intelligence powered weapons are maybe not as scary to our existence as a planet, but I think almost equally threatening to our existence as a species.
Really?
Yeah.
I mean,
think so.
Do you think it would take a large example like a Hiroshima or like that, something that realistic to the human population to understand how intense these AI machines are?
I'm scared that it will.
Yeah.
That, I think, is one of my biggest fears around this stuff. And I came to you when we were talking about doing this podcast with the question that I get when I talk about, developing autonomous weapon systems with my colleagues, which is, if we don't, then they will.
Right.
Which is a really valid argument. And I've struggled over and over again to articulate a good answer to that argument. And I think the best sort of counter argument.
I have to do this every time somebody says articulate on articulate.
Oh, shit.
Whoa, he said it. He got it.
Wow.
Okay.
I didn't even think of it.
No, it's perfect.
Wait, if I say that over and over again, are you gonna have to keep
N-
popping them, or is it one per
I had
episode?
this is the first time I've ever done it, so we're gonna roll with it and see how it goes.
All right, all
I
right.
didn't mean to cut you off there. Well, we're talking about
Yeah, global terror. No, I think the best sort of comeback I have to that is if we all think that way,
Mm.
and if we sort of go down this game theory path of we have to outcompete other, nation states in order to make sure that we maintain military supremacy, then we will escalate until we get to that point of a horrible, horrible thing happening,
Right.
like Hiroshima.
Mhm.
And then we're going to hopefully backpedal and be like, oh, shit,
Yeah.
we have unleashed a power that we cannot have on the battlefield
Mhm.
if we are going to maintain certain standards for, human rights, for global stability.
Are there theories, or do you have a theory of what that event might be?
Yeah, there are a lot of different ideas, but I think there's a couple things about autonomous weapon systems that are, different from, the prior types of weapons that we've had to come together as a global order to sort of like put some guardrails around.
Mhm.
So nuclear weapons, of course, blunt force,
Mm.
just absolutely just massive explosion, obliterates everything.
Right.
Similar with chemical and biological weapons. Maybe you can argue that like with some certain types of biological weapons, you can target them better.
Mhm.
But all the same, very, very scary. We came together, and I think biological weapons is actually an example that I look to as, maybe something that we can draw inspiration from for autonomous weapon systems, because it seems like the scientific community globally did a really good job of sort of self-regulating and being like, if you work on biological weapons, we will shun you from the science community.
Wow.
And I'm not totally up to speed on like, international human rights law and everything with that relating to biological weapons. Of course, they are, illegal to use. It's a war crime. I'm not sure if that was Geneva Convention or whatever,
Mhm.
but we came together and came up with some overall guardrails that we now use to make sure that we aren't using biological weapons. And so far, that has been relatively successful.
Mhm.
I think one of the differences with autonomous weapon systems is that, we talk a lot of times in, robotics and technology about democratization of technology.
Mhm.
And that means making technology more accessible, making it more cheap to build, and making it easier to build systems.
Mass producible.
Mass producible and by people in, poorer circumstances,
Right.
and like, a lot of the like idyllic world of robotics communication wants to be like, all right, we'll democratize robotics. We'll have, people in third world countries like automating the building of their homes, and, we'll do this to decrease housing prices and all this stuff, right? Democratization is a double-edged sword because it also applies to autonomous weapon systems.
Right.
And I think right now we have a situation where all of the pieces of technology to build a really scary weapon for pretty cheap with relatively little technical expertise, all those pieces are out there, and they're almost just waiting for someone to put them together.
Proliferation.
And yeah, and I mean, that's already happening to a certain extent by some large governments. Like
Right.
Israel is building a lot of autonomous weapon systems. The US is. But there's also the risk that a terrorist organization can build a large scale autonomous weapon system.
Right.
And so I think to paint a picture of that, I'll use the same example that I think it was the Future of Humanity Institute, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, put out this video called Killer Robots or something like that.
Slaughterbots.
Slaughterbots.
I
Yeah.
just watched it.
You watched it?
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
awesome.
Mhm.
So that I think is such a great example
Yeah.
of the risk that we have here. So the Slaughterbots, this video that they put out was like a fake tech pitch from like this tech guy.
Mhm.
And he was like, here's this new weapons technology that we've invented and now it's for sale.
Mhm.
And the weapons technology is all of these tiny drones equipped with cameras that can do facial recognition and equipped with a tiny amount of explosive. And the idea idea is
all
that
technology we have.
yes, all of these individual components that we have very powerful facial recognition. We can fit it on a tiny chip. We have tiny, tiny cameras. We have drones that are getting more and more capable. And we do have drones like my lab actually is building like the world's smallest like flying self-powered robot right now. It's this big.
Wow.
And so we're not to the scale that they were where they were like, I don't know, these tiny robots or like or sorry, for the podcast, this big being like, you know, a couple centimeters across.
Right. I'm glad you caught that.
Yeah, of course. And so I think there was a Black Mirror episode, maybe like season 2 or 3, where they had like these little bee robots that would do the same thing that would like blow up.
Right.
Yeah, and so we have all this technology, and now we're almost just waiting for someone to put this together.
Right.
Like, I can tell you that within, you know, like there's a good robotics lab at Penn, but if you got all these people together and gave them a few months, like, yeah, they could build that, you know? And it's like, so we're kind of just waiting for something like this to be built or deployed. I think right now it's just not economically feasible. There are other cheaper weapon systems that people can use more effectively, but this stuff is getting cheaper and cheaper every year, and it's getting more and more effective every year, and it's getting smaller and smaller every year too. And so like that I think is the thing that I fear being like this, you know, big inflection.
And that's like, you know, kind of accidental proliferation, right? But there's also the idea of like deliberate proliferation where a government says, oh, we can't use this technology because we're limited by, you know, humanitarian obligations or whatever.
Yeah.
But what if, you know, this small little terrorist group over here that is somehow on our side, what if they got their hands on it? Kind of thing, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And then in that sense, the terrorist organization can run with it. They also, at that moment, have the technology so they can replicate it and sell it themselves for more money. Things like that.
Yeah.
So you're thinking that we're really just waiting for the ball to drop.
That's currently what it feels like. And also, you know, because of the democratization aspect, it's also harder to, like with nuclear weapons, you can look for, you know, uranium, what's the word? Refinement? What's the word where they make the uranium more concentrated at the radioactive isotopes?
Uranium concentration. You're the smart one between us, by the way.
These facilities, like they need like specific materials. Like this was the whole thing when we were invading Iraq, right? Was Bush was like, oh, they got these types of tubes that they only use for this type of. Turns out he was wrong, but there are these technologies that you specifically need to manufacture nuclear weapons that are relatively easy to detect, that have to exist in large facilities. Similarly, with chemical or biological weapons, a lot of times these things have to be constructed in these like big, like established labs with expensive equipment that comes from specific suppliers. And so there are all these mechanisms to track these supply chains and to identify when there's a risk that this stuff could be happening. With autonomous weapon systems, like I worry that we won't have those systems in place because nothing individually of, you know, these is particularly challenging to obtain or is particularly easy to detect. And so you could have potentially like a bunch of people like, you know, sitting in their houses, you know, assembling these tiny drones that can blow up and kill someone. And we wouldn't be able to detect it. So, I mean, currently, just because of resource intensive sort of aspects, I think that the bigger threat that we're facing right now is powerful nations using these technologies to suppress, you know, people. But I think that is another fear, and maybe a more motivating fear for people who are less politically on the left, because I think as a nation we can all agree we don't want terrorists to have weapons of mass destruction, especially weapons of mass destruction that can be individually targeted to specific people or to specific types of people. Yeah, profiles of people. Like that's a very, very scary thing for everyone. And I think many people would want that technology in the hands of our government. I think we can all agree that we don't want that technology in everyone. I don't either. But I think there's room for disagreement on that across this political spectrum. I think we can all agree we don't want terrorists to have this.
Yeah.
And so I think that aspect of, you know, this dual use technology that is poised for, you know, its sort of introduction into, you know,
mainstream
being a tool of combat. And there's just not much out there right now in terms of good definitions for what autonomous weapon systems are in terms of regulation on an international stage. And it's a little scary to me because I think it will take something like, Geneva Convention level
Right.
to get to that point of coming up with a good definition and a good global agreement of what parameters we want to put around autonomous weapon systems.
And so what does that look like for you?
So in terms of like parameters, like what would?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, there's a ton of different ideas out here, and I think it's a relatively nascent field of study. So lots of different ideas that are changing quickly, but a lot of them center around having a human agent in the loop.
Right, in the loop. So this is like a big part of autonomy, keeping a person, the black box is somebody, leaving a weapon completely on its own to make any decision, completely out of the loop. There are no humans involved.
Yeah.
Completely in the loop is a person controlling it remotely.
Yeah.
And then there's that middle ground of somebody keeping them on the loop.
Right. Right.
Okay.
Yeah. Human in the loop, we call it, which is basically like you have this system. Maybe it's autonomously navigating. Maybe it's autonomously selecting targets. But you have a person who is looking through a screen and being like, all right, you have the go ahead to hit that target.
Right.
And I think that is where a lot of people are more comfortable drawing the line.
Right.
Just because, and the way I think of it is that this inherently limits the scalability of these weapons.
Right.
And the scalability is what makes these things really terrifying. Because if you don't have a human in the loop, these things can scale as much as you can buy them, right? And then you can have like 1 million drones going out in parallel and just boom, blowing people up. If you have humans in the loop, you have a small limitation of scale and you have a little bit more certainty that your target is accurately selected, that you are targeting a military target rather than a civilian target.
Correct. Yeah. The military's argument to this is that these robots are going to make decisions quicker than a human can. So
and more accurately.
There's a human even a human on the loop.
Yeah.
They still are saying, okay, but they're still fallible. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
The robots are going to be able to make
Yeah.
these decisions quicker, faster. What we need them to do, they're going to make the decisions the way we want them to, as opposed to still having a person on the loop. So that's where the line is.
Yeah, and it's a really tough thing to navigate. And I think that same argument of, well, but the robot's going to make decisions more quickly and more accurately and with less bias than human actors, because like the ideal situation is that, oh no, a robot isn't racist. So a robot won't see, a darker shade of skin on someone and assume that they're an enemy combatant when they might be a civilian, or something like that.
But their facial recognition might be a little worse on a person with darker skin, is what I've heard.
Exactly. And that's the point that I wanted to make, is that we we first of all consider these machines to be infallible because it's a robot system. Of course it's right.
There's
it's
no
a
emotion,
computer,
right,
it doesn't have our human biases.
Yeah.
The way that artificial intelligence is trained is built on human decisions.
Right,
It's
and
built on
values.
imitating historical data and the way that humans make decisions.
Which
So-
is
Yeah, it's
Bias,
biased.
yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so they inherit these same biases, and they do tend to do better than an individual human.
Okay.
They do tend to be a little bit less biased than the more biased people who are making decisions. And this applies all across the where autonomy is used. This applies to self-driving cars. This applies to artificial intelligence algorithms that are being used to decide who gets a bank loan and what the rates are, And also it applies to facial recognition and targeting of autonomous weapon systems.
Right.
We like to think that, and oftentimes these things are slightly less biased than humans. But my sort of concern there is that, yes, they are less biased, but they are being automated. They're being made so much faster, and they're being scaled up so much larger that the biases on a proportional level might be smaller, but on an absolute level, because now we're
Right.
scaling so high,
Yeah.
these biases might result in worse outcomes overall for a particular group. And because these biases are so consistent, then and because also we trust technology to be less biased, it becomes almost like, it just cements the biases that are already in place
Crazy. It's
into a
like
really solid
knowing,
system.
like, if it's consistently like a 2% incorrect.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, we can sacrifice 2% of some. It's like making that decision.
Yeah, you're just like,
That's
whereas,
messed up.
one person who's approving loans could only discriminate against 6 people a day. An AI that's discriminating at a far lower rate can discriminate against 6 million people in a single day.
Wow.
It's
Yeah.
like that's I think, and when we apply systems at this scale, I think there's like some game theoretic aspects, like some like, okay, how does this actually affect the system? How does it affect, how the AI works
Mm.
when it is applied at such a scale that it actually is affecting the world that's its inputs.
Right.
There's all these things that I think, are not really prepared to reckon with at that scale.
Mm.
And I think that we are moving forward too quickly towards applying things at such a large scale that we're not going to be able to reckon with these, secondary outcomes that we just can't predict yet.
Right. So your suggestion is almost just to slow things down a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, especially, I think that's a harder argument to make with like, generative AI and like, ChatGPT. Like, I kind of do think that we should slow down with that stuff
Yeah.
until we have, systems that we can put like an accurate sort of like, oh, we know that it's going to perform well within these parameters in this type of application.
Right.
Like, I want to see a ChatGPT that's like, all right, here's ChatGPT for like, for like your school essays, but there's a different ChatGPT for like lawyers, and there's a different ChatGPT for like doctors. Because I think there was that lawyer who used ChatGPT to try to like write some document for his case, and it was like citing all of these fake decisions, right?
Yeah.
Because ChatGPT is designed to produce answers that look real,
Right.
but it can be bullshit,
It
right?
can be. Yeah, absolutely.
And so I would want to see stuff like that slowed down a little bit till we can make confident statements about where it's going to work well and how it's going to work in certain circumstances.
Yeah.
But I think that argument's a little bit harder to make with ChatGPT because the harms are less tangible.
Yeah. Well, and that's what I'm saying is I think that side of things, like, they're not military based. You know what I mean? So it's like that sort of thing is like, I don't know. I kind of want to speed those up so that way I don't know.
Yeah, I
Like,
mean,
and
yeah.
those aren't the things that I'm concerned about being quick. Like,
Right.
those are the types of things that could make my life easier.
Yeah.
Having a chat GPT that's smarter and more accurate.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
things like that. But I do understand that.
Yeah.
that
yeah.
could be dangerous. Me running with an AI. I don't know if that's
Right.
safe for anybody out here.
Right. Yeah. I mean, we could talk for a while about the benefits and downsides of slowing down
Sure.
things like ChatGPT.
Right.
But I think for autonomous weapon systems, to me at least, it's a little bit more of a straightforward argument that we should slow down because the cost of fucking up is so high.
Right.
It's human lives on the line.
Right.
And it is changing global power dynamics in a way that, to my view, exclusively supports those who currently have power. Because it is those who have power who are at the cutting edge of developing autonomous weapon systems technologies, and they're going to be the first to deploy it as well. And even if terrorist regimes start figuring out how to use this stuff, the scale is just going to be a lot less than, global powers are able to deploy.
Yeah.
A common counter argument that I've heard against slowing down, towards marching forward and developing autonomous weapons, which is really compelling. So we put a panel together to talk about autonomous weapon systems, and we invited a bunch of academics, we invited a bunch of military people and like ethicists, lawyers, stuff to give different perspectives on this. And one really powerful perspective came from a roboticist, an academic called, her name's Rujana Baichi. And she actually is the founder of the robotics lab at Penn that I'm a part of. And she is a World War II Holocaust survivor. I think she was born in Slovenia. It wasn't called Slovenia at the time. It was a Soviet state. But she was born in Slovenia, and she was born to a Jewish family and, made it out of the Holocaust in a Red Cross camp. But most of her immediate family died. And so she came up with this horrendous war, just seeing horrible things, seeing the capability of human destruction, right? And so she was telling us that suffering is just something that she never wants to see. And she if we can build a robot system that will fight a robot system so that people don't have to fight people and do those horrible things to one another,
Yeah.
we should do that.
And
We should
that's
be translating to this, different, battlefield of like robot battlefield,
right.
right?
So instead of like facial recognition on humans, how about robot recognition, like enemy robot
Yeah.
recognition, things like that? That's kind of what I had, like the ideal future of what I personally
Hmm.
saw is, the idea that we have a bunch of, instead of like, douchebags in the military out with guns running
Yeah.
around. And not to say that all military people are douchebags, but there are
Happy
douchebags.
Veterans Day, everyone.
Yeah, damn, I forgot about that. But having a nerd behind a screen
Yeah.
control over a battlefield with just robot, like large scale Bakugan or something
Hmm.
like that. You know what I mean? Large scale ripsticks. These little things that we are basically just how much money and power can we put behind technology and keep it in the technology realm as opposed to the human realm?
Yeah.
Like we can have battles and wars, and in a sense, it's almost like a financial war that we're having
Hmm.
against another country.
Absolutely.
You know what I
Yep.
mean?
Yep.
And in that sense, that feels a little bit, while still scary because it can
Hmm.
economically shake things up in our country.
Hmm.
That it just feels more safe than risking these human lives.
Yeah. Yeah. I and yeah, and I think that is a very valid counter argument to slowing down on autonomous weapon systems development. I think the way that I view it is that number one, we're not 100% sure that we're going to reach that future of
Mm,
robots fighting robots.
yeah.
And number two, the path to get to that future will first involve robots fighting humans.
It's a certainty for sure.
Yeah,
Yeah,
without a doubt.
without a doubt.
And that is horrifying to
Yeah.
me
Right.
because you will have such asymmetry in
Mm.
warfare. Like I think just even beyond what we've already seen, you will just have like, a battlefield of it's entirely humans doing a guerrilla warfare or whatever on one side, and then a team of robots where the cost of battle is purely financial for the other side.
Right.
And that is like, to me, that's a terrifying idea.
Mm.
And I don't know how we get to robot versus robot warfare without going through there. I don't
Mm.
see a path.
Right.
And to me, that path through, like, that's going to be a long period.
Yeah.
To me, I think like
It's not something that can just be overlooked.
no, to me that makes it not worth going down at all
Yeah.
because I think that path is going to be very long and maybe predictably is going to result in the extermination of all sort of, groups of extermination or subjugation of all groups that aren't capable
Mm.
of mobilizing an autonomous,
Right.
army.
Yeah.
And the other thing, so beyond that, let's say we do get to this space
Mhm.
where we're now robot versus robot battle. Now, I mean, this is maybe centuries into the future,
Sure.
right? So we're really speculating here.
Yeah.
But the way I see it, that is a very fast paced, and it's like the friction of human costs are gone from this future system, this
Mhm.
future,
Battlefield.
this future balance between powers.
Hmm.
And now it's just like, all right, basically, we have one smaller state with an autonomous army, one larger state with an autonomous army. The the robots battle each other until the smaller army is defeated,
Mm.
and now we just have an arsenal of autonomous weapons trained on the people of this smaller state.
So the people are still behind
The
the
people are
army.
still behind it, and let's say that we're in a state of diplomacy where we can say, all right, you win, right?
Mhm.
But how does that not lead to a single global order of whoever amasses the most autonomous weapons almost
Right.
instantly, right?
Mhm.
Like in terms of, geologic timescale or human societal timescale, like I can see like over a couple of decades, an autonomous army like that really
Mm.
just completely like totalitarianism like we haven't seen before, and maybe not necessarily totalitarianism. It could be a democratic state that has this arsenal, but that kind of singular concentration of power I think is really scary.
Yeah, but I would say that, there's still strategy involved and strategies that you have to implant into these autonomous battle these armies, basically.
Yeah.
And so it's not necessarily, so you're saying a big country with a lot of resources against a small country, have this robot fight.
Yeah.
Say the small country comes up with a good strategy and implants a different algorithm or a different way to battle the bigger army. You know what I mean? I mean, and that's, you would know more than I would, and yours definitely, I could see that happening. But it seems like that's how every battle goes, every war goes. You know what I mean?
Right.
It's like, how come the United States isn't the number one global totality? How come we don't run the world right now? And it's because there are different strategies, and I think that there are other countries that have comparable resources that and again, why isn't China the number one? You know what I mean? Why isn't there a so that's kind of my argument to what you're saying.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think again you probably know more about the machines and everything that it could potentially, yours definitely seems more likely.
I mean, maybe I know more about the machines, but I don't think anyone really knows about how this sort of future balance of power with completely different military technology will go.
This is complete
speculation.
Yeah,
it's really out there.
And kind of fun science fiction, if you will.
For sure. There are definitely a lot of really good science fiction books that explore these possibilities.
Yeah.
I think the more important point maybe that I want to make is that yes, there is a possible future where we have robot on robot warfare where humans don't get hurt, but I think the cost of getting there is insurmountably high in terms of human costs, and I'm really scared of what the path to get there will look like. And I think that is the path that we're currently on. Like currently there's no major international agreement on this. A number of countries have already deployed autonomous weapon systems against people. Israel currently is using a lot of autonomous weapon systems. They have drones that are basically like suicide drones that are like autonomously targeting and flying into shit and blowing up. They have automated sniper turrets that are firing like into Palestine. Like it's these balances of power that are currently already being supported by by developing autonomous weapon systems that I think just further development is going to further exacerbate these imbalances of power.
Right. So as fast as the technology is moving, we should have regulations moving just as quickly.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. That's what I would advocate for. Absolutely.
And I think that's a solid position. You know what I mean?
Thank you.
Yeah. I think that's good. I don't think I could ever even punch somebody in the face, let alone deploy a weapon.
Right. I think it's easier to deploy a weapon than to punch somebody in the face, though. It's a scary thing.
Yeah, it's true.
Yeah. So I definitely and with that sort of panel and workshop that we put together, bringing a bunch of people together, we were trying to sort of start a conversation there. And the conversation has been started in all sorts of different places, and
on podcasts.
On podcasts for sure, people are talking about it. But also in the UN and stuff like that. But it is moving really slowly, and certainly not keeping pace with the development and the deployment of these technologies. And the existing regulations that we have don't really speak very well to the new aspects of autonomy. These things that we were talking about of, should there be a human in the loop? What are the risks if there's not a human in the loop? What is the level of verification that we need, or confidence that we will hit the target that we're actually aiming for, that we need before we deploy these things? It's like cluster bombs, for example, illegal under the Geneva Convention. It's a war crime because we cannot guarantee their accuracy as much as we can with other types of missile, guided missile targeting systems. How do we translate those standards of, you need to have a certain amount of verification and reliability of your weapon system before you deploy it, to autonomous weapon systems? We just don't have the frameworks or the metrics or the testing and validation systems in place to really guarantee those things at all right now.
Can you develop them?
Yeah.
Can you do it for us?
I can't.
You can't?
I would try. Yeah. I would work on that.
Can you do that for us?
Obviously not alone. But that's the thing, is that these things are all completely developable. Right?
Sure.
We have the capability, but we need to come together like in a UN type of format to decide to do this.
Yeah, and so I mean that was a little bit of a joke, but also you like people like you are going to be the ones that need to push it. You know what I mean? That need to step into these fields, and you should do it. You just get on it, dude. What are you doing here recording a podcast? You need to go out there and position yourself to be somebody. I want you in front of the UN, dude. That's what I want to see.
Oh, thanks, Steve. Yeah. That's the dream, right? But until then, I'll go on your podcast. I'll speak into all these beautiful people's ears and say, hey, don't build autonomous weapons, please. And we'll hope that does it for now.
Well, if that's the steps we could take personally, then I'm glad we're taking this, man. I think this is a great place to cut it off, but I do want to thank you so much for being available and open to talk about this.
Yeah, Steve.
You are very knowledgeable and passionate.
It was a pleasure to be in your podcast studio. This is a beautiful experience for me, so I really appreciate it.
Great. All right, well, I'm going to give you a little mic bump, and we'll cut it off here.
Nice.